recording, and then you are good to go.
Oh, thank you very much, Kara. That was the nicest way to say that I'm old.
That was not my intent.
You did it very nicely. So I work and live on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation, which is all around Ottawa. And I want to pay my respects to the Algonquin elders and knowledge keepers of the past, present, and future. So Kara mentioned some of these things. I've put them down as disclosures, and they're more academic in nature than actually financial conflicts of interest, although some of the books do get royalties. The knowledge translation in healthcare has been very successful. Sharon Strauss is the first editor on that one, and I think we've made about $17,000 in royalties, and all of those have gone to trainees in terms of a fellowship. And I have been involved in developing different kinds of models and frameworks in the knowledge translation area. So I'm obviously attached to those and focus on those. And it doesn't mean that other ones that I don't mention aren't important. And I was a VP at CIHR, VP of Knowledge Translation for a few years, but probably the most important disclosure is that I actually have a foundation grant from CIHR, and these are the 7 years, which have now been extended because of COVID, and we were careful with our funding, so we still have funding. We didn't get more money, but we've got more time, so we're going to the spring of 2025. And the whole focus of our foundation grant, which is called the Integrated Knowledge Translation Research Network, which is a bit of a mouthful, is focusing on integrated knowledge translation or co-production, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So over the next little bit, hopefully I'll be able to review the concepts of research co-production, and I will slip in some of the slides I was going through and realized that I usually do an integrated KT or integrated knowledge translation talk. And so in some places you'll see the IKT or integrated knowledge translation as opposed to research co-production. And I will talk about how I think they're pretty similar, and it's okay to kind of use the terms interchangeably. I'm going to present some of the evidence supporting the value of research co-production. And then we have a new book out that's specifically on research co-production, and I'm just going to kind of expose you to that, and there may be chapters or sections that might be interesting to you. So why do we, what's the problem? Why should we be interested in co-production? I would argue it's all about trying to reduce health equity gaps or evidence practice gaps. And we know in the clinical realm that 30 to 45% of patients don't get treatments we know work. So effective treatments are being underused. And in up to a quarter of patients are actually getting care that they don't need or is harmful to them. So in those cases, it's overusing things that aren't good or as good as we would like. And those data come from the US and the UK and Australia and the Netherlands. And most recently, Dr. Janet Squires, who's also at the University of Ottawa, did this massive Canadian review of 174 studies looking at 228 healthcare practices. And those studies included over 28 million Canadians. And what she found was 44% of the practices were underused. And so that's right in line with the international statistics, and which isn't good. But the good news, potential good news, was overuse was less common in Canada at 14% as opposed to 20 to 25%. And so it's not just a Canadian phenomenon, it's an international global phenomenon. And Braithwaite and colleagues from Australia did a review, and they suggested that 60% of care on average is in line with the evidence or consensus-based guidelines. And that's pretty good, except the consensus-based guidelines are not evidence-based, so it's not actually following evidence, but that may be, the next best thing. 30% of care is some form of waste or low value. So that's the overuse kind of things. Like we know that something doesn't work and it should be withdrawn from practice, but it continues. And then 10%, and so this isn't 10% of practices, this is 10% of patients are actually harmed by the care that they received, which is a huge safety issue. So the problem is the latest research shows we really should do something with all this attach research. So doing the research, and so while this is the healthcare context, I think it applies, and you can do the translation for attach. If we have all of this great attach research and we're producing new findings that could really contribute to improved services, better well-being and care of individuals, if nobody's actually acting on those findings, we're not going to see population health shifts at all. And so we're kind of running a treadmill and not making any progress. And so that's why knowledge translation is so important. That's the missing ingredient of how do we go from we've got effective findings to we've got people in the communities, in the healthcare system, in the education system, in the social system, actually using those findings and having direct impact, making direct impact. So if we step back and say, well, why do we have these research practice gaps? Why are there these health equity gaps? One theory, and it's a very old one, is that researchers, so the people who produce the research and the people who use the research, are actually different communities. And they have different cultures and languages and priorities and incentives and timelines. And so they're just not connecting. And so we know that it's not just two communities. Those knowledge users are multiple communities. They're populations and people and healthcare providers and health system leaders and actual communities, for example. And so the notion is, so researchers produce great research. And because they haven't actually interacted with the people who would be using those findings, those knowledge users say, yeah, that's really great, but that's not my problem. And this isn't very helpful. And I had this problem 5 years ago. It would have been helpful to have your findings then. And we want evidence to help with this problem. And the researcher says, well, I need to get a grant and I'll come back to you in 5 years. And as one of our participants in a study said, Elvis has left the building by the time they come back because things move on. So it's this notion of there's a disconnect between the research that's being generated and what's actually being needed. And so this little cartoon kind of covers it, and it's picking on researchers and policymakers, but you could replace the policymakers with clinicians, with patients, with community service providers. So hello down there. Where are we? You're 30 meters above a valley in a hot air balloon. You must be a researcher. How did you know? What you told us is completely accurate, but not at all helpful. You must be policymakers. Yes, but how did you know? You have no idea where you're going or where you are or where you're going, and now you're blaming me. So just a comical illustration of this disconnect between the communities. So what's a potential solution? So research co-production. And one definition is a model of collaborative research that explicitly responds to knowledge user needs in order to produce research findings that are useful, usable, and used. And and I've put in the definition for integrated knowledge translation so you can see the similarities. A model of collaborative research where researchers work with knowledge users who identify a problem, and those knowledge users are in a position to act on the findings. So it does get messy in terms of terminology in the literature, and depending on where you are and which traditions you're familiar with, in different places, it can be called collaborative, participatory, action-oriented research, community-based research, community-based participatory research, engaged scholarship. Mode 2 knowledge production is a term that's sometimes used in the UK. Co-production, co-creation. We're now seeing co-design. And I would argue that all of these have more in common than differences between them, although scholars who work in these different traditions often feel very strongly that their tradition is different, not surprisingly, from other traditions that are out there. And Dr. Tram Nguyen was a postdoc with me and did this study comparing integrated knowledge translation to 4 of the others. So Mode 2 knowledge production, co-production, engaged scholarship, and I forget what the 4th one was. And you'll see in the author list, there's individuals that kind of identify with each of the 5 traditions. And so she interviewed them from their perspective, what was their tradition about, and asked them to identify 1 or 2 of the top papers that really illustrated, and then analyzed it. And then we analyzed all of the data, and then we invited everyone who was interviewed to be a co-author, which totally threw the research ethics committee off, because the subjects were actually the co-investigators, and our model doesn't work that way. And so there were issues of, well, could someone who was interviewed look at someone else's interview? And they could as a co-author, but as a research participant, they shouldn't be. Anyway, we were able to figure it out. And what did we find across these traditions? So they're all about true partnership, not simply engaging people. And so that's a really important distinction. And that all of these traditions are seen as an approach to research rather than a specific methodology. So you can use any methodology. You can do a qualitative study and use a co-production approach to do it. Or you could do a randomized controlled trial and use a co-production to conduct it. And then the core values and principles that came out across the 4 were things like co-creation and reciprocity and trust, and fostering relationships and collaboration and respect and co-learning, and active participation and democratization of knowledge, and shared decision-making on the research team, both in terms of generating the knowledge, but also applying it. So as a snapshot, I think we can think of research co-production as being solutions focused research. And that doesn't mean that it can't be basic science. You can use a co-production model in basic science. You have to think about it slightly differently, but you can still do it. The disability community in the US came up with this slogan when they were feeling frustrated that researchers weren't really paying attention to their needs, and came up with "nothing about me without me." That kind of epitomizes, like, philosophically what we're talking about. The Integrated Knowledge Translation Research Network, our tagline is doing research with the people who use it. And then knowledge users, so the people, and we use the term knowledge users, and others don't. You sometimes see it as researchers and non-researchers, and conceptually we have a problem with referring to a group of people as what they're not, as opposed to what they are. And so that's why we prefer the term knowledge users. And there's issues with the term knowledge users. Some people don't like the word users, and other times it's more than just knowledge that's being used. But anyway, if you kind of just let that go for a minute, who are those people who are not researchers that are involved? Well, policy and decision makers from community organizations through all of the levels of, municipal, provincial, federal, even international. It could be people from industry. It could be clinicians, health system managers, health system leaders, whole communities. If you were doing Indigenous research, for example, the public and patients. So it's anybody who can actually make use of those findings and make decisions based on the research findings that come out. There's lots of different models of engagement. And I like this one because of the different sizes of the balls. And so it's this continuum of engagement starting at the lower end on the left-hand side. So, and if we think of the big ball as researchers, so we can inform and educate, and this is one way out to whoever we think are those knowledge users. And so that's, communications. And then we could be listening. So we go out and find out what people are interested in. That's good. That's better. And then we can have a two-way discussion. So it's actually consulting, and we see this a lot. And then if we move a little bit more, we can actually get engagement. And so that's where everyone's kind of interacting. And then what I mean by partnering is the researchers actually who typically have the power, they get the money for the grant, they hold the money, they get to disperse it. They typically have responsibility for everything related to a project. So they do have and hold more power than everyone else on the team. But that doesn't mean they have to work that way. You can have an egalitarian system. And so this is where kind of you get to the highest level, which is partnership. And then in some of these frameworks, there's another level above that, which would be empowerment. So the partners actually take over and do the research themselves. They no longer need research help. They are able to figure it out and do it for themselves. But that wouldn't be co-production. And so that's why I haven't put that on the figure. So what would make something a research co-production or IKT approach? Well, knowledge users and researchers shaping the question, really critical. It needs to start there. It doesn't mean that researchers can't come up with an idea and then find knowledge users and say, is this of interest to you? How can we adjust it and make it work for you? The knowledge users can come to researchers and say, here, we've got an idea. Can you help us do some research? We think this would be really great. We want research done in this area. And sometimes we actually just get together and brainstorm. And so we actually co-produce the question. So the question doesn't have to be co-produced, but everybody, both researchers and knowledge users, need to actually come to an agreement that this is what we want to do collectively, and this is, where we want to go. Deciding on the methodology could be involved in data collection, tool development, selection of the outcome measures, really important. Examples in medicine, in the area of arthritis and musculoskeletal health, pain, typically in trials, drug trials, the outcome measure has been pain. How can we reduce pain? Because it's very painful for the individual with these conditions. And it wasn't until one of the trialists started to talk to his patients about, well, what outcomes would be most important to you? And everyone was shocked to find out that it wasn't pain that was bothering them the most. It was fatigue. They felt they could manage the pain, but the fatigue was what was killing them. And nobody had up to that point actually been including measures of fatigue to see if the new interventions actually did anything for the fatigue. And all they needed to do was talk to the patients, and they would have, told them this. Being involved in interpreting the findings and crafting the message, really important. So those knowledge users know what other knowledge users are interested in. They know how to talk to those knowledge users because they're parts of those communities. So they can be really helpful in crafting the message around the findings, as opposed to the researchers who have been trained in scientific method. And if you think of the typical research abstract, great focus on the rigorousness and the validity of the findings. And the bottom conclusion is, and more research is needed. And for knowledge users, more research is needed is not helpful. They want to know, you did this study, what did you find? How can I use this information? And then we need to think about moving the results into practice. And then, of course, we need widespread dissemination and application. And although it's been attributed to me that research co-production or IKT isn't IKT unless you do all of these things. I've never said that. And I think it's about researchers and the knowledge users negotiating what parts of the research process they actually would like to be involved with, and facilitating their ability to be as involved as they want to be. And they have to be invited in because they may not even know what some of the steps are. So what's the theory about why this should work? So if you've got knowledge users as equal partners with researchers, the research should be more useful because it's addressing the problems of those knowledge users. So it's going to be relevant to them. It should be more usable because everything is around those findings and putting it in formats that can actually be used. And if that happens, then it's more likely to be used. So knowledge user engagement in developing the research question means that the research is going to be more solutions focused. That engagement also means that as knowledge users are part of the research journey, they're going to have more confidence in the results and in the researchers. So there's a trust that comes up. And because this is all being driven ultimately by the knowledge users' needs, research needs, there's a readiness for the results. So it depends, obviously, if the results are negative, they wouldn't be implementing them. But if they've been positive and they actually have a solution to the problem they started with, they're ready to implement right away. You don't need to convince them, you know, I'm coming to you, I've built this brilliant mousetrap. It really works so much better than all of the other mousetraps. You really should buy my mousetrap. When the response is, we don't have a mouse problem. Our problem is squirrels. Do you have a squirrel trap? And so this notion of create the product, and in industry is pretty good at this. And so is advertising, right? Create the need related, know what the need is, produce the product that responds to the need, and then that's way easier to sell that product than to have to convince someone they have a need for the product, which they may not have or may not think they have. So when we think of the ATTACH project, it really is a research co-production model. It was from the very beginning. Knowledge users, so parents and kids and community agencies and service providers, have been part of the journey from the very beginning. There's 4 principal knowledge users listed on the grant proposal. The governance structure is focused on authentic knowledge user engagement. There's the Parent Engagement Committee and the Community Engagement Committee. Both are chaired by knowledge users. And then in the grant proposal, we also said that we'd use a research co-production or IKT approach. When we started getting the findings, we would work with the researchers, would work with the knowledge users to actually figure out, interpret the findings, craft those messages, figure out what networks to use to get the information out, because everybody across the country needs this information so we can improve the lots of parents and kids across the country. And this is from the actual grant proposal, and you can see one of the deliverables is high quality integrated knowledge translation and high quality end of grant knowledge translation. So a little bit on the evidence. So this is a medical example. It's Project Retrosite. It's several years old now, and it involved cardiovascular research, and CIHR and the Heart and Stroke Society in Australia and the UK came together and funded it. And it was 29 case studies. The largest number of them came from Canada. And it was going back 15 years to grants that had been funded to talk to the investigators to find out what happened. And so then followed them forward for 15 or 20 years to look at what seemed to be related. So with these grants, what actually happened? What were their discoveries? What impact did they have? And could they figure out from the stories what may have been the important factors that were related to better impact? And so there were 2. So researcher engagement with practitioners, so medical practitioners and patients, was associated with high academic impact. So this is articles in high impact journals, and high wider impact, meaning they discovered new ways of doing things, practices that actually got into practice. And so in the case studies, it was the engagement piece was shown to be really important for getting those 2 kinds of impact. And then biomedical research, so some of it was clinical, some of the cases were clinical and some of them were biomedical. With the biomedical research, where there was a clear clinical motivation, so again, kind of answering a question that clinicians had, that was associated with higher academic impacts, so journal articles, and higher wide impacts, again, making it into practice. And so the conclusion was having clinician researchers and clinicians working with basic scientists actually improves, well, it didn't show that it improved the science. It showed that it improved the impact that came about from the science. So another piece of evidence, and I'm sorry, some of this I presented 2 years ago or a year ago or whenever it was that I was last here. But I think it's important to go over it again. So CIHR, when I was there, it came time to evaluate the funding opportunities, the KT funding opportunities and the IKT funding opportunities. And so an evaluation was done in 2011 and 2012. And we actually used a co-production model. So I was the VP of Knowledge Translation. So I was the main knowledge user. And we had people from the institutes, CIHR institutes, who were also knowledge users. And then we had the evaluation team, which were equivalent to the researchers. And I insisted that we work in a collaborative way, and that was not how evaluation was typically done. Evaluation was, they were sort of the police going in to see, had you done what you were supposed to do and what had happened. And I wanted this to be much more about what can we learn about what's been happening. So I only want to show you a few points. So one of the evaluation objectives was, so with all this KT research that's being funded by CIHR, like, is it really any good? And there was a bias at the time that some researchers felt that none of this partnered research should be funded by CIHR, that all of the money should go into the basic sciences. And so that's why the traditional measures became important, so that we could say, well, actually, people working this way produce papers like anybody else. So it's not a substandard science. So in this table, you see in the second column, HQP, highly qualified personnel. So these are students and postdocs that would be workers or trainees on a grant. The third column, academic outputs, so the traditional stuff, articles, books. And then the third column was the KT kinds of things. So knowledge, products, and tools that would be generated. Now, if we look at the rows, the IKT, so these are the research co-production grants. These data came from we surveyed the researchers. The OOGP is now the project, the program stream at CIHR. So you just apply with a grant. It's typically curiosity driven, and this was the open operating grants. And so what you can see under highly qualified personnel, the co-produced projects had 6 trainees compared to 9. But when you controlled for how much money, so that the curiosity driven research had larger grants, they were longer in length and more money per year. But when you restrict it to 100,000, well, actually more trainees were being trained on the IKT grants. And you get 4 publications for $100,000. And so this was a big shock to everybody, because they didn't think that the people who worked in collaboration with knowledge users actually produced much, because they were spending all of their time having meetings and building relationships. And so the academic work never got done, and that wasn't the case. And in fact, it should be 6-4. And CIHR senior management made the evaluators take out 2 of the outputs in this category, which were reports back to the knowledge users, because they said, well, that's unfair to include that, because people doing curiosity driven research don't have to do reports to anybody. And then when you look at the KT outputs, way more with the co-produced research, which of course intuitively makes a whole lot of sense. They're doing this research to answer the question. They're going to, whether it's create a decision aid or an algorithm or an infographic or whatever it is those knowledge users want and need to convey that information so that they can use it. The people in the grant are much more likely to want to do those kinds of things, as opposed to, well, we're going to publish and then our job is done. So in terms of the IKT funding opportunities, what we found was they were more likely to have engagement of more diverse types of knowledge users, and the knowledge users were more engaged in more phases of the research process. So having that requirement of a knowledge user actually made a difference. So this spider graph, what you see here is at the top, creating new health knowledge, strengthening the healthcare system, creating more effective health services, improving the health of Canadians. That is the legislated mandate of CIHR. It's taken directly from the Act, the federal law that created CIHR. And then this output or impact, translating knowledge from research into real world applications, was added. So if we look at the green line, when we asked researchers, to what extent does your research improve the health of Canadians? Nearly 80% of the people co-producing said that. About 30% said they were creating new knowledge. That doesn't really make a whole lot of sense because you can't get a grant from CIHR unless you're producing new knowledge. But I think it was because the researchers doing co-production, their focus was on answering the question, and they interpreted the new knowledge as discovery research, and they weren't doing discovery research, they were doing applied research. I think that's where that came about. If we look at the black line, these were the researchers from the open grants competition. And so nearly 100% of them said they were creating new knowledge, but not so much strengthening the healthcare system, not so much creating more effective health services, a little bit more improving the health of Canadians, but they did think they were doing a pretty good job at translating knowledge into real world applications. So my interpretation is curiosity-driven research and research co-production are really complementary, and we should be encouraging and supporting researchers who want to do either or both. And just as a footnote, it took a year for CIHR to approve this report. And by that time, they had dismantled all of the knowledge translation funding opportunities that said this actually was a good thing to do. So something else that came out was meaningful partnerships. And I'll let you read a quote from a knowledge user and a quote from a researcher. But essentially, the evaluation showed that involving partners in the research happens more often in IKT structured grants. And that was because it was a requirement. So people, if they wanted the grant, they had to demonstrate to the panel members that they actually were co-producing. These grants are more likely to influence the behavior of the knowledge users. So the knowledge user said that it was a useful experience and they got something that they could use out of their research often, and that the grants lead to the creation of real world applications. And then what came out of the qualitative component of the evaluation was this notion of meaningful partnerships. And it's really sophisticated how the researchers who were doing integrated KT or research co-production and the knowledge users thought about it. So meaningful partnerships are characterized by mutual learning, mutual respect, mutually agreed upon roles and responsibilities, mutual recognition of efforts, mutual exchange of information. And I'm on the parents and the community committees, engagement committees, and I think that's the way those committees actually work. Mutual does not necessarily denote that partners give and receive equally, but that all partners play a role in negotiating roles and expectations. So this is, I think, a really sophisticated way of thinking about it. So it's about all of the people involved on the team, the researchers and the knowledge users, are equal, but it doesn't mean that you contribute equally. It's about equity. It's about what you're able and how you're able and what you can give and what you can get out of the relationship. Researchers and knowledge users have different understanding of the roles and responsibilities required of each team member in order to make the obligations meaningful. So it is about negotiating those roles. When do you want to be involved? How do you want to be involved? How often should we communicate? All of those kinds of operational things become really important. And then meaningful partnerships are negotiated based on many factors, including but not limited to resources, external commitments, technological skills, and epistemology. So it's not all wine and roses and chocolates. There are challenges, and researchers who work in a more collaborative, integrated co-production kind of way have identified that the university key performance indicators and measures of performance are often not aligned. And so if you're teaching in personnel committee and your university is really keen on publishing in the highest impact fact journals, then that's what gets rewarded, versus I actually work with people on the ground and we're making a difference, and the impact we're making is real impact as opposed to journal impact. So there is a bit of a misalignment, and I think that's starting, well, we're talking about it a lot more in the academy at the University of Ottawa. As part of my foundation grant, I actually funded a study where they did focus groups with academics around how can we think about this. I know that the union is interested more in knowledge mobilization and can see the value of it. And so we're starting to get progress on, you know, thinking about what these key performance indicators should be. So what do we know about who's doing integrated knowledge translation? So the total KT were researchers who are doing knowledge translation, and much of that is co-production. And then the OGP is the regular discovery research. So just to put it in context, the KT budget was about $10 million, and the OGP budget was about 750 million. So the KT stuff was decimal dust, less than 1% of the entire budget. And when you then look at most, and so pillar one is basic science. So 70% of the open grant competition go to basic scientists. And at this time, when there was KT funding and IKT funding, it tended to go to health services is pillar two, clinical is pillar two, health services is pillar three, and then pillar four is population health. So much more non-basic science. When we look at the age of, or the experience of the researchers, you can see that in the open grants competition, nearly half of the people who were funded had more than 18 years experience. But when we look at the integrated KT, it's more evenly distributed across the segments. So more senior people are doing it, but lots of junior people are doing it, and early career researchers are doing it. And then this one is really interesting. So in terms of gender, 70% of the grants were held, this is the principal applicant, were held by men in the open grants competition, whereas it was only 42% of the KT ones. So women earlier in their career and more likely to be health services and population health were directly impacted by getting rid of all of the IKT programming at CIHR. The rationale, they took the 10 million and they rolled it into the open grants competition and said, well, everybody should be able to now do research co-production, and that they would monitor that to see if that was actually happening. And I don't believe that has happened. So the conclusions from that report, IKT, or research co-production, produces partnerships with knowledge users that often last beyond the funding period. There's positive outcomes in terms of traditional measures of building the capacity of high quality personnel, publications, and end of grant KT. It also produces health and health system impact. There are challenges. It takes time to build the relationships and effort, and there can be disincentives to actually work this way, especially if the university key performance indicators prefer journal impact factors over impact in the real world. So a quick tour, and I think I'm good for time. This next section isn't like a typical paper. I'm not actually telling you, I'm just going to show you what they are so that you can get a sense of things. Kate Sibley and crew from Manitoba did a review of 9 existing reviews of research co-production, and they identified 7 effects. And the word effects was used because sometimes people call them outputs, and sometimes they call them outcomes, and sometimes they call them impacts. But what was identified was working in a collaborative way can affect the research process. So actually changing study designs because of the discussions the team has. The relationships between those on the team. So actually becoming an interdisciplinary team and functioning effectively and with respect and learning from each other. Also found that individuals who were involved in co-production say that they have been, there's been an effect on them. So the quote above of the researcher saying he thinks he's a better researcher now because he has a better understanding of what the context is in which he's trying to do research, because he's working with the knowledge users in the real world. And then that it has an effect on the results and the output of the research. And so this goes to the notion of it's more tailored because you're finding a solution to a problem. And so the findings are taken up and they can change practice and programs and policies and systems. And then communities, so community-based participatory research, lots of evidence that the communities actually feel that they've taken control of these issues, worked with researchers to get the answers and implement them, and their community is much better for it because the community has learned and built capacity to actually solve their own problems. So this is the Integrated Knowledge Translation Research Network, the foundation grant that I told you about, and these next few slides are related to that. So the goal or the aim is to advance the science and practice of integrated knowledge translation. A couple of years ago, there's about 150 people in the network of researchers, knowledge users, and trainees. And we put out a call saying we wanted concept papers on anything. How could we advance our thinking? And we got over 20 of them. And as it turned out, BMC, the journal, was really great because they have multiple journals and they allowed us to let people apply to whichever journal they wanted. And if it went through peer review, and then if the paper was accepted, we were able to say it was part of this series. And so the series has whatever, 23 papers in it. And here's just a sampling to give you a sense of the things that are in there. Fostering the conduct of ethical and equitable research practices, the imperative of integrated knowledge translation and research conducted by and with Indigenous community members, embracing complexity and uncertainty to create impact, exploring the processes of transformative potential of co-produced research through development of a social impact model, conceptualizing the initiation of researcher and research user partnerships, a meta-narrative review, collaborative health research partnerships, a survey of researcher and knowledge user attitudes and perceptions, partnering with frail and seriously ill patients in research, a systematic review, a review and synthesis for engagement, frameworks for engagement in health research to identify concepts of knowledge user engagement, and fit for purpose, co-production of a complex behavioral intervention, a practical guide and exemplar of co-producing a tele-delivered exercise intervention for people with stroke. Dr. Femke Hoekstra was a postdoc with Heather Gainforth at the University of British Columbia at Kelowna, and they did a review of reviews on principles, strategies, and outcomes and impacts of partnered research. And so they actually found 80 some reviews. Not all of them were systematic reviews, but they were reviews of partnered research. And then they tried to make sense of it to pull out, well, what were the principles they were using? And then they've now gone on to do the same thing, but with spinal cord injury. And so brought people from the spinal cord injury research and individuals with spinal cord injuries and organizations that support them together to look at the principles and actually come up with, these are the principles that researchers and knowledge users in this area should be looking at. And just to give you a flavor of what they are: partners develop and maintain relationships based on trust, respect, dignity, and transparency, shared decision-making, open, honest, responsive communication, recognize, value, and share the diverse experience, expertise, and knowledge, flexible, receptive in tailoring the research approach to match the aims, meaningful benefit by participating, address ethical considerations, respect the practical considerations and financial restraints of all of the partners. And then most recently, this is the book, I refer to it as our COVID baby. In 2019, I was going on sabbatical, and this was to be one of the outputs of my sabbatical. And in March, I had to return from Australia. And amazingly, all our chapter authors were willing to play along, and despite all of the challenging times during the beginning of COVID, got their chapters written. I think it was 18 months from beginning to getting the publication out. It came out in June. There's 16 chapters. They're broken down into these sections. And then you can see at the top here, this is the IKTRR IKTRN website. And if you go in under resources, the research co-production and healthcare book is there. And so you can access the table of contents. And we had all of the authors produce 4 slides on their chapter, which was to be the synthesis or the highlights of it. And so Anita Katari did the introduction and kind of laid out the thinking around why co-production was important and what we wanted to say about that. And then this first section on the foundations of research co-production, conceptualizing and theorizing for research co-production, equity, power, and transformative research co-production, the effects, facilitators, and barriers. And so that's the slide that I showed you above from Dr. Kate Sibley. Then the next section in the book was working with knowledge users. So Joe Cook and colleagues from the UK did working with knowledge users, research co-production with patients and caregivers, conducting a research co-production project, principle-based approach, a view from within, organizational strategies for effective partnerships. That's Sarah Bowen. And in fact, this may be something for those of you from community organizations, third sector organizations. We produced this. It was mainly for health organizations. We had done studies, qualitative studies, to find out that many organizations have not always had very good experiences with researchers. And so we produced this other document, which was our relationship with research. And it actually kind of walks through for an organization saying, you know, here are questions maybe if you haven't thought to ask yourself, what's your strategic plan related to research? How do you want to use research? Do you have a process in place for when researchers come to you and say, we're really excited, you'd be a great partner. I need you to do this because we have to submit the grant in 3 days and I'll write the letter for you and you sign it. Do you have a process for reviewing that and then saying, thank you, but no? And by the way, we're not keen on being contacted so late in the game, but this is why we're not interested. It's not a problem that's a priority for us. But if you came back with this kind of a project, we'd be much more keen on it. So how do you work with researchers? And then when you decide you want to partner with researchers, what's that process like? And I think we argue that you need to actually check out the researchers to see if it's a good fit. And especially because people have had bad experiences. As researchers, we're all tainted by those bad experiences, even if we are good partners ourselves. Managing academic health service partnerships, that's Dr. Ali Hutchinson from Australia. They have a brilliant system at Deakin University in the School of Nursing and Midwifery, where they have a chair position that's half funded by the health authority. There's 5 or 6 health authorities in the state of Victoria. So there's 5 or 6 nursing chairs, and that professor spends half of the time in the health system and is the link for all of the trainees and to build nursing research and midwifery research capacity in the health system. And then the next section is grant writing, dissemination, and evaluation. I led the chapter on suggestions for how to write a good co-production grant proposal. There's 4.2, which is co-produced dissemination. So even if you haven't done a co-produced research project, at the point where you're starting to get findings, you can actually bring knowledge users together to help you interpret the findings and then work collaboratively to come up with what's your dissemination plan and how to execute that. Evaluation, co-production research. So the International Development Research Centre, which is a government funded agency, Canadian government funded agency that funds research in developing or in the global south, they have Research Quality Plus, which is a framework for evaluating the quality of research. Rob McLean is a senior evaluator at IDRC, and the team actually took that as kind of the framework and then put a co-production lens on it to say, well, what would those quality issues or criteria be if you were thinking that the grant was produced in an IKT kind of way? And then the last section of the book is research co-production competencies and incentives. Trainees and research co-production. Dr. Christine Cassidy is another former postdoc of mine. And so this is around the challenges that trainees have. So often supervisors say, oh, for goodness sake, don't do anything in partnership. It's going to take you too long. You're never going to get your PhD done. Wait until you get your postdoc and you can do it then. And when they do their postdoc, their supervisors say, oh, your postdoc's only 3 years. You don't want to be wasting time trying to develop relationships and doing something useful. You need to get publications because you need to get a job. And that's what's going to get you a faculty job. And then when they're an early career researcher, their department chair says, oh, for goodness sake, don't do partnered research. You need to get tenure. And the best way to do that is to knock off a whole bunch of papers. So do stuff that you can do papers quick. So all of these things don't help build the capacity of trainees to actually want to or actually be able to do research co-production. And then there's a chapter on the role of funders and how they can actually influence the ecosystem, research ecosystem, to be more co-production friendly. And then the last chapter the editors have written. We don't have slides for that one because we're actually turning it into a journal article. And we haven't quite figured out, well, we could have put it in, but anyway, let's not go there. So we synthesize all of the findings to kind of pull out what are the common threads through many of these chapters. And then I know I've only got a few minutes left, and so I'm not going to go through this, but I just wanted to show you what these 4 slides are like to entice you to go to the website, and then you can decide whether there might be value in any of these chapters for you. So there's an overview, and so this one was, working with knowledge users. So the notion of it's a way of being with, as opposed to doing to. And then there's usually how can we co-produce research? So in this case, it's focusing on, it's all about dialogue and it's all about iteration. And then there's actually 5 principles that Joe Langley and colleagues had identified from their work at the Sheffield Clark in the UK: sharing power, including all perspectives, respecting and valuating the research knowledge users equally, reciprocity, so giving and learning, mutual benefit in these relationships, and then building the relationships. And then there's typically a slide on the key learning points, or 2 slides for that matter. And then this is my grand puppy, and I just wanted to show you that the book, and so this is my office. So I have turned my chair around to take these pictures, and so I often put books and papers on the bed, and she likes to get up on the bed. She's behind me at the moment, and so it can be used as a pillow if nothing else. So hopefully, as you reflect on that very quick tour of research co-production, that maybe there's some little thing that you've gotten out of the presentation, hopefully. And so thank you for the patience, and apologies for being a little bit late. I don't know why I couldn't get in on the first go. And I will stop sharing my slides.
No worries. Thank you very much. And I'm seeing lots of applause. Now, I know that we're coming to the end of the hour, but are you okay, Dr. Graham, to stay on for a bit to answer any questions?
Yes. Yep.
Awesome. Okay, so please, you can raise your hand and unmute yourself, or you can put questions into the chat box, whichever you prefer. Oh, I see hands up already. Okay, Nicole, I saw your hand first, so go ahead and ask your question.
Really great, and I resonated with so many things you said, especially, oh, don't do that for your doctor, don't do that for your postdoc, don't do that for your, because you're up for tenure. There's so much discouragement to work this way, but it has so much power and impact. I mean, that's certainly what I've observed. And I'm just kind of wondering about whether there's hope out there, because, he pointed out that the KT programs were gotten rid of. We all have right KT plans in our CIHR grants now, but do you think it's getting better? And actually, do you think that there's appreciation of how much time it takes? And so people that are truly doing this work need more money, and they need to be appreciated for what they're able to contribute in a different way.
Yeah, so I am optimistic. And we did a study, and so the irony is we also interviewed senior people who had tenure and didn't have to worry about anything, and said, so, you know, this is the perfect time. You can do whatever you want. And they said, oh, you got to be crazy. Why would we do it? It's way too hard work. Right. So in that sense, it's screwy, but I am really optimistic because I think our trainees and our early career researchers really get it. And it's kind of in their DNA that they want to do things that are going to be useful and helpful. And so they are just naturally attracted to working in this kind of way. And they're a little bit rebellious. So they push back, and they may not be able to do it exactly like the co-production the way they want to because their supervisor won't let them, but they get a second committee that's an advisory committee. So it's not their thesis advisory committee, but it's an advisory committee to the thesis research. And so they are able to work with knowledge users directly, and the academy still does its regular thing. So I'm really enthusiastic about, I think we have lots of people and they're going to make the difference in the long run. In terms of funders, I don't think they do appreciate the time that it takes. On another project that Kate Sibley has, that funded by CIHR, we have the data, and what we found is since 2012 or 2015, when they shut down those programs, people are still doing co-production, which is really positive. The grants are longer in length and more money. My concern is so that's a good thing, except if I think they're giving out fewer grants to people who are doing co-production. So the ones that are getting it are getting more money and more time, but a lot of people who would have been getting it before may have been shut out, and we don't know how that actually is playing out. And CIHR actually does need to pay attention to that, and hopefully some of Kate's work will help them to think about that better.
Thank you. I wanted to just, before I jump into other questions or comments, I think that our call-in user, I know that if you're on the phone, it's really, really hard to ask questions, and I know you came off mute. Did you have a question? I want to make sure that you have a chance to ask one if you have one. Okay, feel free to interrupt anytime. Sorry, just double checking. All right, so lots of comments about, wonderful presentation, comments about importance of building relationships, trust, respect, and transparency. I'm going to ask you a question myself. So I had two thoughts, and I wanted to get your opinion on those. So one of the things you were talking about, how the next level might be empowerment. You didn't go into empowerment because that's not technically co-production. I have to admit that one of the panicked responses I had, thoughts I had when you said empowerment, is that I have worked with agencies before that are like gung-ho research excellent, but they don't, how do I say this level? They're not trained researchers, so they don't necessarily know about pitfalls in data collection, problems with how you ask questions,
yep.
represented, I don't know. So I'm wondering, is that something that comes up at all? Because I would like to think as a researcher that there's still space for me at the team, at the table.
Yeah. Yeah. So I didn't talk about that because philosophically, so I think it's great if organizations want to become self-sufficient. All of the things that you raised are really important considerations. So if they don't actually have advanced training in research methods, that can be problematic because there is an expertise that you need, right? So for me, it goes back to this notion of the two communities, but it's really the multiple communities. And the strength of it is I bring expertise in knowledge translation and co-production. You bring expertise in your area. People with lived experience are bringing their expertise with whatever the lived experience, but they also may have other jobs. You know, they're accountants, and so they can be really helpful with the budgeting of whatever. And it's us working together as a team that is actually the most powerful thing, as opposed to, do we want to create an organization that's completely self-sufficient? And then maybe what they need to do is, you know, hire researchers and embed them so that they have the appropriate and adequate research. So I wouldn't tell anybody not like the organization shouldn't be empowered to do everything themselves. And especially the empowerment piece ties with citizen science, right? And the movement in different areas that people say we can figure out how to do the science, and we can do that. And so I haven't studied that. I haven't worked with groups where their goal was essentially to put researchers out of business by taking on that work themselves. Because I philosophically, and it's because I'm a sociologist, the strength of it is all of us bringing our different perspectives and our experience and our knowledge. That's what makes it really powerful.
Thank you, because I shouldn't have. I had a mixed reaction. It's like I feel guilty for being panicked, because that sounds like a wonderful thing. There was a request for the URL for your IKTN. Thanks, Nicole, for popping that into the chat. And then, well, we're 5 minutes past, so I don't want to keep people too long. Are there any last questions that speak now? Well, Dr. Graham is on the line.
You can email me anytime. Happy to chat.
All right, we will do that then. So thank you so much. Our next talk is going to be end of November, last Friday in November. That's going to be Nicole, and we're going to have a question and answer period from some of our families attached to the ATTACH study. So please stay tuned for that. We're going to be disseminating that soon. And again, if someone wanted to attend the talk and missed it, please let them know this is going to be on the ATTACH Teachable website. And thanks again, Dr. Graham. You're getting a ton of thanks and applause and thank you. So we really always lovely having you here.
Well, thank you for having me again. It's really special.
All right, I will let everyone go have their Friday, and we will talk soon. Thank you again.
Great.
Bye.
Bye.